for most tonight. Rain spreading north but staying dry in the northwest with lows of 2 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
And welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale, and don't forget we have an extra Cross Question this week. Tomorrow night we'll have a panel of financial experts answering your questions on the autumn statement tomorrow from 8. With us on the panel tonight we have Ben Bradley, Conservative MP for Mansfield and leader of Nottinghamshire County Council. You're almost a veteran on this programme now. You've been on quite a lot. We have two debutants on tonight. We have Jayne Ozanne, former government advisor on LGBT issues and chair of the Ban Conversion Therapy Coalition. She herself, it says here, is an evangelical Christian, so you might want to ask a religious question tonight. Feel free. We also have Carla, another slight veteran. You've been on a couple of times, haven't you? Co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, and another debutant, Dave Penman, who is General Secretary of the FDA Union, which represents senior civil servants. Now, if we don't get a question on bullying tonight and possibly mentioning the Deputy Prime Minister, Dave is going to be very, very upset with our listeners. So, I mean, I don't wish to guide you or lead you in any way, but hey, 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You can text 84850 and you can submit your question via Alexa. Just say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC and then just say your question. And don't forget, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Now, our first question is from Ben in Clacton. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Iain. Good evening, panel. What do the panel think about London, the city, losing its place in Europe as a financial capital? And since 80% of our economy depends on the services provided by the city.
That's the sort of question that strikes fear into the heart of anyone appearing on the programme for the first time. So well done for that, Ben. So let's go to somebody who, as I say, is a veteran. Now, I'm not sure Ben used quite the correct terminology there, because I think it's Paris has overtaken London as the place that has the most stock holdings. It's sort of 2.8 trillion or something compared to London's 2.7 trillion. But symbolically, this is not a good thing, is it?
Well, clearly not. I think, far from me to proclaim to be an expert in such things, but clearly we would like for our financial services in particular to be incredibly strong in that competitive kind of world stage. It's a massive issue that impacts the economy of the whole country, and clearly one of our biggest exports in that space. So, look, reputationally, London and the financial centre of the country is hugely important. But equally, everybody is struggling from that perspective. We're not uniquely in an economic challenging place. The whole of the Western world, in many ways, is kind of struggling with the same issues at the minute. A lot of global challenges around economic growth, around potential recession. So we're far from alone in that sense. I think, we've obviously got autumn statement tomorrow, and we'll hear from the Chancellor about some of the ways that he intends to try and tackle that. I would be the first to kind of hold hands up and say, look, the last 6-8 weeks has not been a lesson in sound management of the economy from that perspective. But I think there are all sorts of factors. As somebody who doesn't represent an area in London, who is a big fan of the kind of levelling up agenda and actually looks after a particularly disadvantaged part of the East Midlands, I'd like to see us spread that wealth and that economic growth around the whole country and not just focus on London.
You haven't mentioned Brexit. Has that played a role in this?
There's all sorts of factors. Brexit's clearly one of them. COVID is clearly one of them. Ukraine and global conflict is clearly one of them. It's really difficult to do cause and effect, isn't it, when you've got so many competing factors at play at the same time.
France has gone through COVID. France is coping also with the consequences of the war in Ukraine. You could say that France has had a worse time because of the amount of energy that they import from Russia. Brexit seems to be the hardest word to say.
Well, we've said it several times already. I think there are all sorts of impacts from Brexit as well, with trade and with other elements of that. I have always been clear that Brexit is a journey, not a one-off kind of overnight things change. Most of the rules that we had when we were in the European Union, we copied and pasted into our own legislation, and it clearly takes time to unpick all of that. I've been frustrated that throughout COVID in particular, the kind of Brexit changes, the benefits that you might accrue from divergence in effect have been delayed, because clearly we've been tackling those global health challenges. But I think we're starting to focus on some of that now. We might even see tomorrow in the autumn statement some of their plans around regulation, around making Britain more competitive, that we can now do as a result of having left.
Carla.
Well, I think you were right to mention the B word.
Shows how impartial I am, doesn't it?
I think that this is yet another example of exactly the kind of things that were warned against when the UK was deciding whether to leave the European Union or not, and I'm not terribly surprised. I think the Conservatives' mismanagement of the economy over the last few months also has a lot to answer for, and I think has really put to bed once and for all the idea that the Conservatives are good with the economy. That said, the UK economy is quite over-reliant on the finance sector and in the city, and it, although I don't think this is a good thing, it may be a helpful prompt to diversifying our economy and making sure that there are good jobs spread more evenly across the UK.
But I suppose, I mean, the City of London generates a huge amount of money, generates a huge amount of tax money, which is then used to spend on public services. And I mean, I rather agree with you that maybe other sectors of the economy need to be strengthened. But the worst thing that any government could do was to try and weaken the financial institutions in the City of London, and maybe lead to sort of more figures like this coming out.
I agree that it's a symptom of mismanagement, yeah.
OK, Dave Penman from the FDA.
Well, I think, financial centres compete with each other. So inevitably London is competing on a global stage around that. And that will be about competition for people, competition for where companies want to trade and do business, and competition around regulation and how easy it is to operate. So I don't know the reasons why Paris is now overtaking London, Brexit, and the potential for challenges around regulation and more regulation could well be one of those reasons. And we've now left the European Union. We don't really have a choice around that. We have to get that right, because, as you say, it generates a huge amount of income for the country, which helps fund public services. And whether we think there should be a more balanced economy between services and manufacturing, or geographically, what we have to make sure is that where we have a kind of world-class financial centre, it remains competitive on that kind of global stage. So whatever the reasons are, we need to address them.
And again, we should emphasise, this is not Paris overtaking London as a financial centre. It's overtaking London as to the amount of shares or the value of the shares that are held. London is still the second biggest financial centre in the world. Jayne?
Well, I think what we've seen is the inevitable working out of the chaos of the last 6 weeks, arguably 12 years, as you've said, Carla. I'm glad you mentioned Brexit, because it does seem to be the one thing that our Tory politicians, do not want to name. And until we have some honesty, and I hope tomorrow we will have some honesty at the dispatch box about why we have been through the financial chaos that we have, why we're facing some of the huge inflation issues and potential even higher interest rate hikes, we need to build trust, and that will only come by actually talking about some of the issues we found so hard, and that is about the fallout from Brexit, the implications for the workforce, the lack of workforce that we have, the fact we've got a wage issues. They're all playing out now, and we need to be honest about it.
But virtually every other country in Europe has got labour shortages, just as we've got. How can you just blame that on Brexit?
Well, I'm not just blaming it just on that, but it was interesting. Well, it was interesting listening to the Governor of the Bank of England this afternoon in the Treasury Select Committee, and he was giving 3 reasons why his forecast hadn't worked, and the third was about labour shortages.
Was one of them because he's completely incompetent?
Ooh, no. Well, I, that is above my pay scale, I'm afraid to say. I don't know. But I was listening with interest. Of course, we heard about COVID, and of course, we heard about the Ukraine war. But he also talked about the labour shortages. And we know that that's an issue. We know that many have been calling for that to be addressed. And I'm afraid to say that Brexit has had an implication on that.
How
I
do-
say
how
that
do you
as
vote
someone
the-
who voted for Brexit.
How
So,
do- so it's your fault?
well, you can say it's my fault.
So you're
but ultimately,
converted rejoiner now, are you?
no, I'm just being honest about some of the problems that we've got, which I don't think we've had.
But when you
if-
look, we have net immigration from the EU, despite Brexit. I mean, people talk about the fact that they seem to think that everybody who's European went back to their countries in the EU. Now, some did in the pandemic. There, I think you would have a point. And often they have decided not to come back because they quite like it where they are.
Well, it depends what type of skilled worker we want and what sort of age range. We've talked about, actually, we need to bring in young skilled workers who are prepared to work at the living wage and do jobs that many people don't want to do. We've got, crops rotting in the fields. We've got restaurants and hotels that haven't been able to open because they don't have the staff. And I think, we need to be honest about these challenges.
Isn't that more, I mean, we're going slightly off the topic, but it's an interesting discussion. Isn't it slightly more about the fact that since the pandemic, we've now, 5 million people are economically inactive, people who, for whatever reason, and it's not just health, some of them will be for health reasons, totally legitimate. Other people have just decided, you know what, I don't want to get back in the rat race.
Well, I'm not sure. I think most of that is because of health reasons, and I think the long COVID and actual trying to re-socialise a lot of people has been part of the difficulties too. But again, it comes down to being honest about the facts, and this blank denial about, actually, we don't want to talk about that, we're only going to blame it on Ukraine and COVID, takes us to a place where nobody has trust in the system anymore. Dominic Raab stood at the dispatch box this afternoon, it was afternoon, I think, by the time he got there, and said, we're going to be the fastest growing country according to the IMF. Well, that's because we're at the bottom of the pile. Let's be honest, Dominic. We need to look at some of the factors that play, and until you do that, we're going to have a problem with trust.
Absolutely agree.
Well, Dominic Raab, I think is going to come up in the next question, but let's quickly go to a break. It's 14 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
17 minutes past 8. We have with us Ben Bradley, the Conservative MP for Mansfield, Carla, co-leader of the Green Party. We've just been hearing about her rugby playing exploits, which were I just can't imagine you playing rugby, Carla.
I know. I was also a cox for rowing, which is a bit more imaginable
That
given my stature.
That I can imagine. Because how tall are you?
Nearly 5'2".
Nearly 5'2", it's the nearly bit. Dave Penman is General Secretary of the FDA Union. Now, that used to be called the First Division Association, but it's a bit elitist, isn't it?
It is. It's when we started in 1919, and it used to have a first and a second and a third division of the civil service representing the different grades.
Right. So. And Jayne Ozanne is former government advisor on LGBT issues and chair of the Banned Conversion Therapy Coalition, which I'd guess does what it says on the tin.
It does.
Why?
It's trying to.
I mean, I don't. We might have a question on this later. I don't know, but just why is this such a big issue for you?
Well, I went through it willingly for 20 years, and it nearly killed me. Sadly, I ended up in hospital with my body packing up because of the strain of the mental anguish that I'd gone through. And it took me to a very, very dark place where I really couldn't see a way through. And I know too many people who haven't found that way through and have taken their lives. And particularly young people who are growing up in places where they have no one they can turn to because their family, their religious leaders, their teachers, their whole cultural community believe it's the right thing to do. Well, so we must ban it. And, we've been working on this now for nearly 4.5 years. And, the government in particular needs to bring forward the legislation. It's promised twice now in the Queen's speech.
Well, if you want to ask about that, you can do so on 0345 6060 973 or indeed anything else. Right, a text question from Chris in Lewisham. I'm an FDA member. How important is it to support union members who are bullied and intimidated by ministers? Can't think who you're thinking of there. Michael in Rains Park has also texted in to say, question to Dave Penman, does throwing a tomato into a bin aggressively in front of a member of staff really count as bullying in this day and age? Well, Dave, let's come to you first on this, because okay. I mean, the background is obviously the allegations that have been made against Dominic Raab. Two have been put on the record now, and there is going to be an investigation.
Yeah, there is, and obviously, over the last week, we have heard a variety of allegations against Dominic Raab from a number of government departments. The point we've been making is that's not an effective way to deal with this. There needs to be a robust system for dealing with complaints against ministers from civil servants, which there isn't just now. The only way a civil servant can raise a complaint against a minister is under the Ministerial Code, which requires the Prime Minister to consent to an investigation in the first place, and the Prime Minister is then the final arbiter of it. And as we saw with the Priti Patel investigation, despite an investigation concluding that she had bullied civil servants, including shouting and swearing at junior civil servants, the Prime Minister sat on that report for 6 months and then ignored it and said she hadn't breached the Ministerial Code and resulted in the resignation of his ethics advisor. So civil servants currently have no confidence in the process around raising complaints, and that's what needs to change. So we've now got an investigation by someone independent, we are told, because there isn't an ethics advisor, because there hasn't been since June, so there isn't even anyone to investigate a complaint, even under the flawed processes that we've got just now. Dominic Raab deserves to be able to defend himself. He deserves a robust mechanism that will clear his name if he hasn't done anything, and they'll do that effectively and quickly. And civil servants deserve an independent process, free from political interference, that will deal with the facts and come to conclusions if they have been bullied.
What constitutes bullying in your mind? Because I mean, if I think about newsrooms, for example, I mean, there can be high-pressure environments where from time to time tempers can get frayed and people say things that they might regret later. I suspect if you're a minister and you keep being told, no, we can't do this, minister, you get frustrated and maybe lose your temper. Now, it shouldn't happen. But does that really, I mean, throwing a tomato into a bin aggressively, does that constitute bullying?
I mean, you can take one minor instance and try and work out what that means. It depends. I mean, there is no legal definition of bullying, but bullying behaviour can come across. There can be, there are people who are bullies who essentially have little kind of microaggressions. They undermine people. They say things publicly and demean people. They're constantly negative. And it's that kind of drip feed over the longer term. You also have bullies who explode for any number of reasons and will shout and swear, and it's that more kind of classic aggressive attitude. Bullying can manifest itself in many ways, which is why the people who investigate this understand that. They will not say, well, actually, you're a bully because you threw a tomato and there's no other evidence. They'll look at the evidence, they'll look at the impact on an individual, look at the motivation, and deal with the evidence and the facts of what people say. That's what we need, essentially, because a bullying environment is an inefficient environment. It's not a place where the best work takes place. And what's really important with the challenges that the government faces is that the talented public servants who are there, dedicated, trying to deliver for the public, can do so and give the best of their ability. And they can't if ministers are bullying. You lose talented people out of the workforce in an environment because they're going to say, well, why would I put up with this when I can go work somewhere else? So bullying is not... It's not about robustness of ministers. It's behaviours that are really counterproductive in the workplace.
Jayne?
Well, I believe it's Bullying Awareness Week, and the Anti-Bullying Network or Coalition do try and define bullying, from what I understand. And they've got three things, which is there needs to be an intent of harm, there needs to be an imbalance of power, and it needs to be repetitive. Now, it'll be interesting to see how that could be applied to ministers, but I think all of them will say we didn't.
Always an imbalance of power,
exactly. There will always be an imbalance. There will always be some repetition because you're hearing these stories. The question is whether they intentionally meant to hurt someone. But the truth is, if you're saying something to slap someone down, to push, to shut them up, to make them feel less than, then that to me is intentional. And the same website actually quotes some research from Finland, I think, at the end of the 90s that says that bullying normally happens in a group. It's a pack mentality thing. It's something that becomes a culture. Well, exactly. And one has to ask, what sort of culture have we got, dare I say, even around the cabinet table, if it is seen okay for, we're hearing repeated cases now, aren't we, of ministers acting in a certain way. And I think there's something quite, dare I say, rotten there. We need to look at what is acceptable. What sort of culture are we creating amongst, and Ben or others may want to speak to this, but what sort of culture have we got? Because this is not acceptable. It's not the way we need to, I think, be role models to a nation that finds it very difficult to cope with stress anymore.
But Ben Bradley, you're leader of Nottinghamshire County Council, a big organisation, and I'm presumably you have issues here. I'm not saying that your council is rife with bullying, but I mean, it'd be interesting to know what processes you have as a county council to deal with this sort of thing.
Sure, I'd like to think it's not, for the records, but I think it is right and fair. I agree with Dave. There has to be a robust independent process here. I think the difference and the challenge in politics in particular is that we can't be naive to the politics. There are also all sorts of partisan reasons why people might want to get Dominic Raab sacked. We've seen it with Suella, we've seen it with sometimes a bit of a witch hunt around cabinet as to who people might want to get rid of at any given time.
Well, they shouldn't give them the excuse then.
Well, no, they shouldn't. But equally, we shouldn't be removing people from roles off the back of trial by media. I think it is important that there is an independent process. Dominic has submitted himself to that process, as far as I can understand.
Suella broke the ministerial code. Gavin Williamson broke the ministerial code. That isn't politics.
Well, Gavin's gone. I mean, there'll be rights and wrongs in all of that. I think there's also an element in politics in particular where it's impossible, seemingly these days, to hold your hands up, say, look, I made a mistake and be forgiven. We never let these things go, do we? We're judged by our worst mistakes. I'm the first person to say I've made mistakes in my political time, said stupid things, and you get held to account for them, but they never get let go.
Security breaches? I mean, those are big mistakes.
But in terms of your question about the council, same challenge. We have robust procedures. We have kind of independent panels that judge these things exactly the same. I think we have a relatively good and happy workforce. All the stats suggest across our local authority, but we have had an incident recently that speaks into the same question, I suppose, about elected people, because the rules are slightly different around elected people. You can't sack elected people from elected office in the same way. We had an opposition councillor, I should say, an independent councillor, who was convicted of harassment and convicted in his other council, he's a district councillor as well, of using his position to harass members of the public. And I can't get rid of him. And that's hugely frustrating, even though he's been convicted of a criminal offence. Some of those things are absolutely wrong, and there are all sorts. There are other examples around the country of politicians on a local level in that position, and we can't get rid of them.
But are we getting to a point where a minister can never raise their voice in any circumstance because they'll be accused of bullying?
It speaks to the point that you made before about the different criteria. What is bullying? Intent of harm, I think, is one. You can have an angry conversation, perhaps regret it, perhaps have been riled up but not mean harm. And also, in a position where there is an imbalance of power, there's an extent to which you are the boss as well. And if I've told you that this is what I want and you're telling me you're not going to do it, well, I am the boss. And there has to be that respect as well. That's not to speak to these particular cases, because I don't know what's gone on. I read the tomato story, I have to say, and thought that was a bit ridiculous. But equally, in all of these places, your independent reaction is your own, isn't it? I might have felt that was a particularly aggressive thing in the context of something bigger. I don't know the answers to that. But look, there'll be a process. And I hope that if that process exonerates Dominic Raab, people will then let it go and move on, because that often doesn't happen in politics.
Carla?
Well, that's why we need a proper process, just as Dave was saying. Bullying is unacceptable in any workplace, and I think a lot of what's gone on in Parliament in the last few years would not have been tolerated to anything like the same extent in most other workplaces. And I think that ministers and politicians especially have a responsibility to set a good example, especially as they are literally setting the laws by which the rest of us are held. It's vital that Rishi Sunak appoints an independent ethics advisor as soon as possible.
Which he did say was going to be one of the first things that he did, but we're still waiting.
Indeed. But once again, what we have here, as Jayne was saying, is an issue that goes to the heart of trust in politics. And when issues like this keep coming to the surface, public trust in politics is understandably diminished. And that's bad for our democracy. Because if people think, oh, I can't trust politicians, then it's harder for the good politicians, the honourable politicians who are in it for the public good, to get elected and to make change.
But do you as a party have an anti-bullying policy? That, I mean, if somebody came to you and said, look, I won't use any names, but sort of somebody, I feel that somebody has bullied me, what would happen?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a complaints process and a whistleblowing process that would kick into gear, and it's ridiculous that in the current situation, ministers are judge and jury of their own behaviour. That can't be allowed to go on.
Can I say, I mean, that point about robustness and you can't have a kind of harsh word. Civil servants, I speak to every day, they want robust, passionate politicians who care about what they're doing and who drive them to deliver public services. That's what they do. They choose to come into public service. It's those who actually, are some of the most able public servants in the country, the ones working closest with ministers. They feel the tension and the pressures of delivery of government as well as ministers do. There is no question about that. What we're talking about is when behaviour is counterproductive. And I think that's the point around this. Is actually
one
getting in the
person
way.
will draw a line there and another person will draw a line there. Which
is exactly why an independent assessment is needed, surely.
And it's looking at the evidence. But what we've got, we now in Parliament have a situation where there's an independent process, but there wasn't. We saw what happened in Parliament where over 5 years, not a single person raised a complaint, yet when they conducted an independent inquiry, several hundred came forward with horrific stories of bullying and harassment. That was because MPs controlled the system of dealing with complaints, and we now have exactly the same situation in government where the Prime Minister entirely controls the process for dealing with complaints, and we wonder why no one's bringing forward a formal complaint.
Well, George on Twitter says, I'm sure John Bercow is listening very carefully to these excuses for bullying. I remember interviewing John Bercow for 15 minutes on the day that he was found guilty, and it was as if nothing had happened, Nothing to see here, move along. Anyway, we'll take more questions. Thank you for your answers on that one in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:31. News headlines with Darragh Jackson.
The Prime Minister says the country needs to get borrowing and debt under control to tackle inflation. Price rises have hit their highest level for 4 decades. The rate's currently at 11.1%. The Polish president believes an explosion which killed 2 people in his country yesterday was probably caused by Ukrainian air defences. But Ukraine's president says he has no doubt that it wasn't. And Prince William says he'll be supporting England and Wales in the Qatar World Cup. The Prince of Wales, who's also the head of the Football Association, has been criticised for giving only the English team a special send-off. LBC weather cloudy and wet for most tonight, rain spreading north but staying dry in the northwest, lows of 2 degrees.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
Ben Bradley, Carla, Dave Penman and Jayne Ozanne with us answering your questions. Just a final tweet on the bullying issue, which I think is a really interesting tweet. It's from Jazza Brazza. Funny names on Twitter, aren't they? Bullying is about a pattern of sustained behaviour over time. One isolated incident, such as throwing a tomato in isolation, may be considered insignificant, but as part of an ongoing pattern is definitely not. I suspect we can all subscribe to that one, can't we? Right, let's go to a very, very different question, although it is about a bully. David's in Victoria. Hello, David.
Good evening, panel. My question is quite simple. What would the panel propose to do about Putin specifically, the ultimate bully, in his criminal actions against Ukraine? How would they propose to deal with him?
How would they hold him to account, I guess? Ben Bradley.
Well, aside from, send the SAS in with sniper rifles, which I'm all for, I think if we'd probably have done that, if it was that
break
simple
international
to do.
law.
Yeah, but sometimes, I'm not in government, so I can say things like that. No, but there are, in the same way as we've just been discussing, there are processes for this, aren't they? I feel like, and it's only from what I read, Unconscious Hour, whatever media outlet you look at has its own biases in whatever direction, same as international media does, but it feels to me like there's growing pressure on Putin domestically. At whatever point he is no longer in that position, and we're able to get access to him, I hope he'll be hauled through the international courts in the same way as any other global leader would be. The challenge, of course, aside from the SAS option, which I repeat that I am all for in the current context, I think it's how do you get hold of him in the first place?
Isn't this a sort of heart-ruling head thing where, look, we can all agree if Putin wasn't there, things might return to normal, but you can't, as a member of parliament, advocate the assassination of another head of state.
Look, I think the reality of the situation, regardless of rhetoric around it, is we can't get hold of him, can we? He doesn't come out of his building, so it's almost an irrelevant conversation. I think there are.
I sense a certain rowing back coming up.
No, look, clearly, you just said if he wasn't there, I think the situation would be different. I think most of the international community would quite like to just wake up tomorrow and somebody might have done that, which is call that advocacy or not. But there are processes, right? The challenge that we will have in terms of accountability is, I think, how you find a place where you can actually get enough access to him to be able to make arrests, to be able to make prosecutions.
He will basically never be able to travel out of Russia again, will he?
I imagine what will happen is he will end up living as a recluse in some public building somewhere for the rest of his days until he's gone, which is no justice for anybody, is it really?
Carla Dania.
Well, this is the question, isn't it? How do you hold to account someone who does not respect international law or international norms in any way? First of all, I think the UK is right to be providing support to Ukraine, military support and other aid. But yeah, of course, we can't be judge and jury on it yet, but it seems clear that war crimes have been committed, and so I very much hope that will go through the international courts in due course. That needs to happen. Of course, there's the international sanctions. I don't know what stage they're at now. Certainly last time I checked, there were still some that could be strengthened, could be tightened up, so there's still room, I think, for the UK and the international community to do more there. And another thing that I think that we could do to hold Putin to account is to help Russians to hold Putin to account.
How do we do
So there's lots that could be done in terms of supporting journalists to build a little bit more of a free press in Russia, which basically doesn't exist at the moment. If we're supporting journalists, human rights campaigners, democracy campaigners in Russia, that allows the people of Russia to hold him to account.
But we can all say we support them, but what can you do beyond just mouthing support?
It can be financial support, it can be equipment, it can be training. There are foundations, there are journalist organisations, for example, that support directly with training and funding journalists in areas that don't have a free press, and that, to me, is really important work.
Dave?
Well, we've got a fascist on the European mainland waging war against democracies. We have to do everything we can. So I think what's vital is we maintain the support for Ukraine and able to defend itself. I think ultimately that will be critical around what happens to Putin over the longer term, at the outcome of that, as well as for the people of Ukraine. We have to maintain and strengthen the sanctions against his regime, both against individuals and unfortunately the country. And I think what's really important, not just about Putin, but about the next fascist that will come along in Europe, is that he's seen to be held to account however long that takes. As we saw in the former Yugoslavia and what happened there, where war crimes are committed, it's really important that the international community bring those responsible for those war crimes to court, regardless of how long it takes. And that sort of commitment is going to be difficult because of the difficulties of dealing with Russia and the size of the state and the reliance that many countries are on its natural resources. But it's really critical, not just about Putin, but about other dictators who will look and see what rewards there are for that sort of behaviour.
What about what Ben was saying about assassinating him?
I mean, I hope that was a flippant comment. I think the whole point about talking about the rule of law is that you uphold that, and people understand what that's actually going to mean. That's going to mean, and for a head of state to be dragged before an international court is ultimate humiliation. That will have a stronger and resonate longer than any attempt at assassination or whatever or outcome like that. And again, the international community needs to stand as one. We've saw what this means. It's modern history around how these fascists operate, and how the ramifications for that, not just for countries like Ukraine, but what that will mean for countries across Europe.
John on Twitter reckons that you should have been quoting Brandon Lewis here, and that we should break international law in a limited and specific way. Jayne.
Well, it's funny, Dave, you're calling him rightly a fascist. I'd call him a terrorist. And I think what we saw yesterday, which was over 100 missiles being launched at primarily civilian targets, trying to take out infrastructure, backs that up. These are war crimes, and yes, we must use the full level of international law. But let's be honest, we're dealing with what I see as a wounded bear. As someone who has lost Kherson, who's lost Kyiv, who's feeling that he's on retreat. And I must admit, I Googled, how do you deal with a wounded bear, believe it or not, just before I came on. I did. I don't know. I'm that sad. And you won't be surprised, Ben, yes, that some people say, well, obviously you need to shoot it. But one of the best ways of dealing with it is to send in a bigger bear. And the question is, who is that? What does that mean? Well, what does that mean? So Viktor Orban would like to send in... Thank you. I am sorry, everybody, for tapping my hands. That's my energy. So Viktor Orban has suggested we send in President Trump. I think we have to send in the Russian people.
We might be talking about Mr. Trump a little bit later. Yeah. Right, we are with Ben Bradley, Carla Denyer, Dave Penman and Jayne Ozanne. We'll be getting more questions and more answers, well, more questions from you and more answers from them in just a moment. It's 8:44.
LBC.
party.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
We have with us Ben Bradley, Carla, Dave Penman and Jayne Ozanne. Let's take a text from Mark in Chelsea. Can we afford to not massively increase defence spending in the budget tomorrow, given the war in Ukraine? Carla,
Well, you won't be surprised to learn that as a Green, defence spending is not my favourite area. As I said earlier...
In the circs?
I do support the support that the UK government and many European countries are giving to Ukraine. I think that's right. Whether we need to massively increase, I'm slightly less sure. It's good to be keeping up the levels we're doing now, but there are so many areas of public spending which are incredibly important and which never really recovered from the last round of swingeing cuts. It's pretty clear that some of what we're going to hear from the Chancellor tomorrow is about taxes, but some of it is going to be about cuts in spending. Now, they're being misleadingly called efficiency savings, but I can tell you from my experience as a local councillor in Bristol since 2015, there is no fat left to trim. There are no savings to be made. And this misguided approach of cutting funding from public services that are already failing is just misguided.
Dave?
The first job of government is to protect its citizens. We face uncertainties that we probably even couldn't have predicted 12 months ago. I think that raises significant challenge about defence spending. It's not just about the support we're giving to Ukraine, it's about the consequences for a new Cold War for the UK. So I think, like lots of areas, I don't think it's a matter of a choice between the health service or spending. I think about government looking at priorities and saying one has got to spend money well, but actually, if the need is there in terms of protecting the UK and our role in the international community requires greater funding, then that's what has to happen. You know, government is about making decisions and tough decisions. That doesn't mean that has to come at the cost of other public services.
Jayne?
Well, I understand that we've led the way globally in terms of our support for Ukraine, and I think we need to continue ensuring that they get what they need. The US is paying the lion's share, but there's concerns that the US may be going soft, and we need to stay firm. Whether it's a massive increase, I don't know. I don't think it's just about money. They need people, they need intelligence, they need our personal support. But I think we need to continue doing what is right, proper and fair.
Ben?
I'm always hugely conflicted on this. I think in the international circumstances, defence spending hugely important. I'd expect it to be at least protected tomorrow, if not increased. I came into politics, I have to say, because of very local domestic things. And I've always said that if I had £1 and only £1, I'd give it to schools. I think that's the start of everything and the future. So, you know, I'm, in the current circumstances, supportive of maintaining where we are and continuing to be a huge supporter of Ukraine. I also think we could be cleverer about how we spend other budgets, foreign aid, for example, and how you use that on a world stage for to spend money in the right way. Just pick up on Carla's point on local government as a council leader. I think there are huge challenges in local government budgets we're trying to set as at the minute. I think the answer to some of that is local leadership and flexibility. If I just had my entire council's budget unring-fenced to spend on what I wanted, I wouldn't have a problem. The problem is because so much of it is dictated centrally, I have to spend it on things that are not priorities for me on a local delivery level. There's money in the system, funding hasn't reduced, it's demand and inflation that's gone through the roof.
So when the government mouths localism, you have to issue a hollow laugh because they're dictating what you spend.
Well, when government mouths localism, I say, yes, please, that would be brilliant. We're negotiating a devolution deal at the minute, will give us some more of that. But for example, I've got a £34 million bus service improvement budget. At the same time, I'm going to have to cut subsidies on local buses because my bus service improvement budget is ring-fenced, so I can't spend it on buses. If I could just control it...
That's ridiculous.
The system is mad. Anyway, let's move on. A tweet from Lucy in Wrexham. Qatari World Cup organisers have apologised after threats were made to a Danish TV crew who are broadcasting live from the streets of Doha. How can we make sure high-profile events like the World Cup never get sent to oppressive places like Qatar again? Jayne?
By making sure that FIFA put in some clear regulations, are transparent about why they choose the places they do, and that they actually have some guts to do the right thing. I mean, I think we all know that there's another story behind why Qatar got the World Cup, and it's not a pretty story. I'm glad that it's now getting the attention, albeit, negative press about what's going on, but we have to make sure that this is not repeated. And I think that the Qataris, need to think hard themselves about how they want to be perceived, because right now their brand is not a strong one. And if I was David Beckham, I would not be...
Or Gary Neville.
Well...
Or Gary Lineker.
Or Gary
the list goes on. Dave?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as a Scot, we have very little interest in
Sorry. We can move on to Carla if you like.
It feels like a test case in corruption. Just everyone, I think all football supporters across the world just were aghast at the decision, on so many ways, environmental grounds, why it was given to a country with such a record on human rights. It just seems such an extraordinary decision. And I think that point about FIFA actually looking at how we can make sure this never happens again, but also I think for the kind of broader international community, the countries where they're big contributors to FIFA and have a lot of influence in the football world have to look at how they allowed FIFA to be in a position where it could make such openly corrupt and ridiculous decisions.
Because it wasn't as if no one commented on it at the time, was it?
No.
We all knew something fishy was going on. Ben?
Well, since day one, it's been a ridiculous decision for a whole variety of reasons, practical ones, not least the moral ones. The heat, the time of year we're going to have it makes a mess of everybody's football calendar. So for all sorts of practical reasons, it's ridiculous. And therefore, the only reason I can see is that there must be money involved in that decision. And it's amazing, you listed some names there, how moral people are until the checkbook comes out, which is incredibly frustrating. But I do think you said the words test case there, Dave. I think it's probably right. I think off the back of the heat that will come from it, and also the real focus and scrutiny of the whole country and the whole situation, off the back of it, I would be very surprised if FIFA are in a rush to make similar decisions anytime soon.
Carla?
Well, I think the answer to this is similar to the answer to the question about bullying in Parliament. It's about transparency, it's about proper, accountable processes, and well-tested criteria to make sure that the right decisions are made and that everyone knows why they've been made. And that would apply to FIFA and all other international sporting bodies.
Right, this is a bit of a quickfire section of the programme now, isn't it? Let's go to an Alexa question from Brad in King's Cross. Last night, Fox News cut away from Donald Trump's campaign launch and didn't show the whole thing. Do Rupert Murdoch's media outlets still matter in the social media age? And Rupert Murdoch has basically told Donald Trump that I don't think he's going to support him if he is the Republican candidate. Dave Penman.
I think they do. They still have a huge influence in America in terms of news, and particularly with the kind of political grouping that watch Fox News. So I think ultimately it will have a big play. They were a big backer of him. One of the reasons why he got the airtime and support and money that he did to be able to go for it the first time around, and I think it'll have a huge impact on him this time around. Whether he thinks he can circumvent that with his own social media platform, etc., I very much doubt. Fox, I think, will be absolutely critical to the success or failure of Donald Trump.
Carla?
Yeah, absolutely. Traditional media is still really important. I think it is still
particularly radio, obviously.
Of course. And I suspect that quite a lot of your listeners are on social media and do get some of their news.
Oh, believe me,
media.
look at that screen.
Well, exactly. However, most people do still get their news from TV and radio. I get a lot of my news from radio. And so, yes, it is really important. And so it puts me, and I think a lot of people, in a weird situation of really wanting to make sure Trump gets as little support as possible, but feeling a bit peculiar being on the same side as Rupert Murdoch.
Had to happen sooner or later. Jane?
Well, I think we saw this summer what role the media had in terms of swaying people's minds in the leadership contest. I think there was a pile-on one of the candidates, on Penny Mordaunt, and I thought it was disgusting the way that so much of the media tried to quote, take her out. So we see that this does have an impact. Obviously, there are Trump supporters who will always be Trump supporters, and they'll follow him on social media. But for him to become president, he needs to win the middle ground, and he's not going to do that without some support. And I do respect Rupert Murdoch for once. I think there was a quote in the Washington Post, wasn't there, that said actually it was the sure way of Republicans losing is for Trump to be their candidate. Well, carry on, Mr. Trump, because I think we need to keep Democrats in the White House.
OK, Ben Bradley.
On American politics, I think Joe Biden's making a real mess, if I'm honest. Not that Trump is the answer in my book, but I think it is the most bitter and divided country I can point at, if I'm honest, and that's horrifying for the rest of the world. But the media are hugely influential in all of this, in politics as a whole, which is also worrying in many ways. You pointed to examples there of media stories that create headlines as opposed to reporting headlines, and that's certainly the case in the States. It's the case here as well. I worry more so about social media, I have to say, and particularly the algorithms and the way that we talk to each other now, where we are consistently grouped with people who agree with us, and we consistently feel like everybody in the world agrees with me, and we therefore have no ability anymore to have a sensible debate and disagree.
Apart from on this programme. As Carla is about to demonstrate.
Well, I just wanted to say that while we here in the UK have the luxury of a bit of distance, that we can be a bit flippant about this news. Really, my heart goes out to the Americans who are fearing another few years of division that will be probably caused by Trump's campaign.
Which is basically inevitable with that announcement last night, wasn't it? Right, final question. It's a caller this time. We normally have a text at this point, but it's Dean in Gainsborough. Dean, what would you like to ask the panel?
Hi, good evening, panel. My main question is to Ben. Now, Ben used to play, if you don't mind me saying so, hockey at a very, very high level in goal, which takes a fair amount of nuttiness to start with. Can I just ask, is Ben still playing hockey? I know he's very busy. And what sports do the panels take part in at the weekend? Thank you.
Right, we're running out of time, so brief answers, please.
Fine question. Hello, Dean. I wish I could play hockey. I don't have time. I now spend my weekends.
But you did play it at a high level.
I did. I had England trials when I was a kid. Played at National League for a long time. Since children and work, it's a real struggle. I now spend my weekends taking my children to their football. I coach some hockey. I referee my kids. Absolute sports nuts. So I'm still very much involved.
Jayne?
I love the water, so swimming, kayaking, scuba diving, anything on it, in it or under it. That's me.
Lots of comments I could make there, but I better not. Carla?
Yeah, I'm a water baby too. I am really into my swimming. I used to swim competitively for my town when I was quite a small kid. I'm nothing like competitive level now, but still really love going for a swim. It's a great way to take my mind off politics.
Dave?
I cycle a little, not a lot, but most of my weekends are taken up with my daughter and swimming lessons.
Well, I used to play hockey as well, but not to the level that you did. I was a centre forward and would score a hat-trick in every game, mainly because I was a goal hanger. Thank you very much indeed to all of you, to Ben, to Carla, to Dave and Jayne. In a moment, we're going to be talking about employment opportunities for people with autism or a neurodiverse condition. I've never really heard of that phrase before, but it's in the news today, and I'll explain why in just a moment. It's going to be a really interesting hour. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Prime Minister says his Chancellor will set out a plan to grip inflation in his autumn statement after it reached a 41-year high. It rose to 11.1% in October, higher than expected and its highest level since 1981. Jeremy Hunt has warned of tough decisions, but Rishi Sunak insists the plans will be fair and compassionate. Leader of the Scottish Labour Party